So, as I mentioned in some of my previous videos, one of the things that I want to start doing more of is trying to focus on, or at least give a spotlight for, smaller games on the Breakdown series, and not just have it entirely about, AAAs or similarly large games that have large marketing budgets, etc., etc. I'm obviously still going to do a lot of those, but I mentioned that I kind of want to see Steam go back to the, 2010 to 2012 days of the way that there was some really, really good indie stuff on there. And I guess the sort of small part that I have to play in that would be to focus on games that I may not have even ever heard of if it weren't for the developers contacting me or my friends talking about it. So this is a very small such game that I would never have, it just would have completely passed by me, called Moss Destruction. And it is a twin-stick shooter-esque sort of in control, but has a lot of roguelite mechanics in it as well, which of course I basically am contractually obliged to cover anytime that happens. And the idea of the game is that you have a sort of a very short time to go between each level, and this is a common thing in certain roguelites, the idea that the levels they don't have a hard timer, like, when the timer runs out you lose, but they have some sort of timed mechanic that makes it difficult to persist past a certain time. And this game definitely has that, and I actually kind of like the way that this game does it more than a lot of other games that I've tried it with, because it has a bit of risk-reward involved in it. So basically the way this works is each level is, of course, a randomly generated area, some of them more canyon-like, some of them are bigger open fields with little mazes in them. There are several different tile sets in this game, and they're actually kind of pretty, but we'll go on to the art style later. And as you can see right now, as you stay in the levels for a longer period of time, the area gets dark because dusk happens, and as that happens, things get harder. Enemies spawn in, and just in general, stronger stuff will appear. Things that are kind of would be considered like the out-of-depth monster experience, unlike an actual full-on roguelike, that sort of idea. And if you're not careful, you can be very quickly overwhelmed. In fact, I would say that the game does maybe go a little bit overboard at this part, where the nighttime monster attack is really quite intense, we'll say. They spawn in really quickly, and if you don't leave almost immediately, you can get overwhelmed. The idea behind this is that, as in a lot of roguelite games, you have a sort of persistent upgrade system and a persistent currency that you can find to actually use it. And in this case, it's these green crystals that you'll see around the place occasionally. Those crystals drop from enemies occasionally, very occasionally, and they can also be given by doing specific actions, like, say, a combo of a large number of kills in a short period of time, things like that. Things that involve sort of like comboing weapons and items together to create a large effect. Those often will reward you with these crystals. And at night, when things get really, really difficult, enemies' drop rate for these crystals actually skyrockets. So if you want to stay for a longer period of time, you can actually farm a number of these in a short period of time, if you can survive. And these crystals are spent on a shop that you actually find in the level, which is somewhat unorthodox, because in a lot of games like this, there are multiple shops. There is usually a currency that you have and can spend in each run exclusively, and then the sort of meta currency that you spend in some sort of upgrade system out of the run itself. In this case, there actually is no currency for the run. There are no shops that allow you to buy items or anything like that. Instead, there are two systems that sort of take that place, being the weapon crates and the upgrade system every time you rank up. Just kill enough enemies and you'll eventually rank up, and then once you get to the gate to the next floor, you can choose a number of upgrades, sort of passive upgrades generally, for every time that you ranked up. And the somewhat interesting thing about this is you can actually only rank up twice per floor. Normally in a lot of games like this with a sort of level up system or similar, it's basically unlimited. You're only limited by the sort of experience curve, where eventually enemies will be worth less and less and you'll have to move on if you want to get stronger. In this case though, it is a hard limit of 2 ranks per floor, it seems, and once you attain that second rank, you cannot gain any progress towards the next one until you move on. So that keeps you moving, as does the ridiculously high spawn rate of enemies at night, and as well as the fact that if you're feeling good enough, maybe you can sort of camp out near the teleporter to the next floor and use some of your spent or built up ammo, spend some of that to maybe survive a little bit longer at night and get a bunch of these crystals. Now, these shops that you find are one use per floor. They're on every floor guaranteed, but once you go in them and then exit them, the teleporter for them disappears. So you have to make your purchases in there while you're in there, and that's it. And these are... Actually, this is where a lot of the depth for the game comes from. In my opinion, there's a fair amount of depth in the sort of upgrade and unlock system. The overall weapons and passive perk idea, like this mech tech stuff right here, is fairly simple in itself, but adds up to be a fairly interesting way to play the game. However, a lot of the upgrades and things that you can get over time in this shop with the meta currency crystals are where a lot of the depth comes in. You have several different types of upgrades that you can buy in there, things like these cartridges. They actually look like NES cartridges, and there are passive and active versions of those, and every run you actually equip them before you begin, which again is pretty unorthodox for this style of roguelite. Generally, those are items that you find, in a run, and perhaps buying them in the meta store simply adds them to the list of possible things that you can find. But in this case, that's not how it works. You actually make a build, basically, before you begin the run, and there are 3 different mechs that you can choose from, and they all have sort of a different number of these slots in different places to put in the various passives and active upgrades that you buy. There are also global upgrades that don't actually need to be applied, per se. They just affect everything. And other types of things like, say, you saw that mech tech earlier, where you level up and then you can choose different passives dependent on what is available in a list of 4. There are more of those available, for instance. The ones you start with aren't all of them in the game. There are many more. And this really is sort of the whole idea behind the game, is to just collect all these crystals and try and get yourself to a spot where you can have better and better equipment to make it farther and farther, which I find kind of interesting because it's just a little bit of a twist on the traditional way that roguelites are done, and the only kind of immediate similarity are the weapons, because you, of course, find weapons in a run instead of buying them. The gameplay itself, as I mentioned, is fairly simplistic, but is fun enough, I would say. It is probably made better by 2 big things. One being the weapon selection is actually fairly interesting. Things like your kind of standbys for games like this, like sort of pulse rifles, shotguns, miniguns, all that sort of stuff. But there's also some really interesting things like these big sort of electric arc weapons, and a couple of other things like that use the fuel resource, like a sort of bouncing fireball thrower and a bouncing shotgun. So there's definitely some variety in the actual weapon selection, and it's pretty fun. One thing I will say though about the combat is the feedback isn't great. Especially when we're talking about the melee feedback, everyone has a melee attack on right click and it just hits everything close to you. But as simple as that is, it doesn't actually seem to do that every time. It can hit multiple things at once, and in fact there are combos that give you crystals and things specifically for hitting multiple things at once, but it doesn't always do that. For some reason, you can sometimes hit an enemy that's quite far away from you with the melee, but the second you have 2 enemies right next to you, using it will not hit either of them, or will only hit one of them. It's kind of strange. The melee is very... it lacks a lot of feedback. It's not satisfying to use, and is just a bit confusing in terms of how it operates. Its range is very... it's not consistent, basically. And there are upgrades to it to make it better, but honestly, I find that the upgrades tend to just make it look different, and because its actual performance is so inconsistent, better doesn't really mean a lot necessarily, because it isn't great in the first place. So that's, if I had one major complaint about the game, it's definitely the feedback in combat in general is a bit odd, and it's a bit lacking. Your melee feedback isn't great, and the feedback that you get from being hit is also not great, because it's entirely possible to lose basically your entire health gauge in a very, very short period of time from a couple of focused hits, which makes sometimes deaths where you just sort of turn a corner, there are a bunch of enemies that have fired at you and you don't really have time to react and take like almost your entire health gauge worth of damage immediately, just really unsatisfying. You didn't really have a chance to dodge those shots or do anything with them, you just sort of got hit. And you may not have even been aware that you were getting hit for about a second until you realize that you're missing like almost all your health all of a sudden. So that is one thing that I would say needs a bit of work, is the feedback, the combat feedback, we'll call it. Now, this is a boss fight, and I would say that this is where the combat is actually at its best. The boss fights are fairly interesting because they use a very large open area, and sort of a storm of ads and large screens of bullets and the like to actually make weaving around them interesting and more, I suppose, that kind of steps over the whole feedback problem thing when you have so many things going on at once that your focus is on dodging and weaving and returning fire and all that. It just makes the combat more interesting. So I would say that the boss fights are actually pretty good, despite the problems that the combat does have. The other thing that I think helps the game is its art style. It's sort of adorable. I don't know if that's actually the intent behind the art style that the developer was going for, but it's cute. Everything has this sort of, it's very colorful, and almost like, I don't want to say clay, but definitely like not metal or stone or anything like that. The sort of material that everything is made out of has a very sort of soft, moldable look to it. It reminds me of like a kid playing with an action figure set, you know, like a Lego set or something like that. That's what it reminds me of, and like I said, I don't know if that's actually what was intended, but that's definitely what it sort of comes off as to me, and I think it actually is in the game's favor. Everything's very bright and colorful, and when you're dealing with a lot of these sort of energy weapons and stuff like that, it helps to have all these colors everywhere because it makes things feel a bit more impactful and interesting. The way that enemies sort of, they don't just die and disappear, they break into a lot of little pieces, like breaking and like a Lego figure apart or something like that. It just has a sort of endearing quality to it that makes it all look like a kid playing with a toy, and this is what's going on in his mind as he's doing it. That's sort of what it reminds me of. The other sort of big problem with the game, and why I haven't been able to show you any far into the game footage like I usually like to do, is that it has some crashing issues right now. This is the sort of post-first boss area, this sort of blue grassy area with some mazes and some other pretty fun stuff in it. Actually, I like this area a lot. It's pretty fun to go around. But for some reason, the game is a bit crash-prone when it gets to this part. Oftentimes when I get to the boss mission, it will crash before the boss loads in, or it will crash as soon as I load into this world after I beat the boss. So something surrounding that boss in general seems to be a bit unstable or something like that, and I often can't get particularly far into the game because it just starts to crash a lot on me. Regardless of if I'm doing good or not, it just won't work. And I don't want to say that is a widespread issue that you should like beware a whole lot, because I haven't really seen other people saying this, so I assume it's not like a very large problem that tons of people are having, more that it's probably the classic video game developer issue of an incredibly specific problem only being present for an incredibly specific number of people and being really annoying to nail down as a result. So hopefully things like that do get resolved, but I think the game as a whole is fairly interesting. It's available for $15 on Steam, which personally I think might be a little bit high. I would be more comfortable at, say, around 10, but I suppose I also haven't been able to experience all the content yet because of those crashing issues, so maybe my view on the price isn't necessarily as valid as someone else who has been through the entire game and knows its full depths. But that is Moss Destruction. It's a fairly cute little sort of twin-stick roguelite that you could definitely do worse than playing this one if you like either of these genres, because it has a bit going for it with its art style and its sort of weapon variety and the general depth in the upgrade system, which actually makes multiple runs feel interesting because of what you know you're going to be able to use and work towards next, which is a big part of games like this. So overall, I'm not sure that I could recommend it myself because of those issues that I've been having, but it's at least something to look at if you are interested in games like this and you have sort of a gap in your schedule to try a new one. So yeah, that's Moss Destruction. The link is, as always, in the description below this video to the Steam page, naturally, and that's that. Thank you guys very much for watching. Any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and I'll see you guys next time.